Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Asango Valikula. I'm the director of the center, and I will be chairing this meeting. It gives us a very great pleasure to welcome Dr. Rebecca Tapscott to give us a paper this afternoon. She will be speaking. She's an Ambizione fellow and lecturer at the Hirschman Center on Democracy at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. And she will be speaking on the topic of militarized masculinity and the paradox of restraint, mechanisms of social control under modern authoritarianism. I have had the good fortune to have dipped into her forthcoming book, which is absolutely fascinating. I am not an Africanist or a Uganda specialist or particularly sort of an expert on feminist approaches to that. I look at this from a very, very general constitutional democracy, constitution making, democratization point of view. But I found her work incredibly fascinating, and it's a real pleasure to welcome Rebecca and have her talk to us. I would also like to very much welcome our internal and external discussants who will offer a few remarks on Rebecca's presentation. First of all, after Rebecca's presentation, Dr. Philipp Schulz, postdoctoral researcher at the Institute of Intercultural and International Studies at the University of Bremen, will offer some remarks. And thank you, Philipp, for agreeing to participate and to join us. We are very pleased to have you with us. And then secondly, our very own Christine Bell, professor of constitutional law, member of the center, and the head of the political settlements research program at Edinburgh, which does a lot of work in the area of political settlements and democracy here at Edinburgh. So it's a great pleasure to both have what promises to be a fantastic paper, as well as two very well qualified discussants to speak to us. Very welcome. So the form will be that we will keep it fairly informal, as we always do with center events. I will ask Rebecca to make her presentation, after which Philipp first, and then Christine, and then we will open up for Q&As. And for this, please just raise your hand using the raise hand function, which is right at the bottom. You'll see a tab for reactions, and then there's raise hands. And depending on the way that the conversation is flowing, we will either put questions to Rebecca one by one or take a cluster and then get her to respond. And finally have hopefully a few minutes if Philipp and Christine also have something to say towards the end. So that will be just the general ground rules. But apart from that, and without further ado, Rebecca, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And so I, of course, have a PowerPoint here to share. Thank you so much for having me here today and for this opportunity to share this work with you. And also for having such amazing discussants here. I'm really delighted to have Christine and Philipp here, and really looking forward to your comments. Just wondering where all your beautiful faces went. Here, okay. So today I'm presenting an article of mine that came out in International Affairs a few months ago, titled Militarized Masculinity and the Paradox of Restraint, Mechanisms of Social Control under Modern Authoritarianism. And though the article is finished, I do hope to extend this research to a larger research project. So, all your comments, questions, and suggestions will go to great use for me. The article is really concerned with this question of how modern authoritarians project power over society. I find this question especially interesting in states that first have democratic institutions that can theoretically be used to hold rulers accountable, and second, in states that could somehow be characterized as low capacity. And by low capacity, I mean that these states are unable to monopolize violence in a given territory and to provide basic services reliably to their citizens. And in this sense, they lack some of the tools typically understood as key to exercising social control. This inquiry is highly relevant at the moment. Global trends continue to offer new evidence of authoritarian rulers that extend control over society despite democratic institutions and low state capacity. So in this paper, I identify and explore an understudied mechanism, that is militarized masculinities. And building on scholarship from feminist international relations, I show that militarized masculinity is fundamentally characterized by contradiction, and argue that this contradiction contributes to its political productivity. I then show that this tensile contradiction replicates the contradictions of modern authoritarianism, making militarized masculinities an especially potent tool to project power in these contexts. So today I'm going to walk you through the argument, first by situating the paper and its key terms, and then demonstrating the relationship between militarized masculinity and some of today's modern authoritarians. I'll then turn to some of my fieldwork in northern Uganda in 2015 to show how this national level gendered performance can permeate to the grassroots and help authoritarians exercise social control. So in this paper, I focus on regimes characterized by what I've called the paradox of restraint, in which rule of law compliant reforms are used to undermine checks on the executive's arbitrary power. These regimes are characterized by the coexistence of democratic institutions on the one hand and arbitrary use of executive power on the other. For example, in Hungary in 2011, Orbán's government pushed through constitutional reforms to increase the jurisdiction of the Constitutional Court. This had the effect of flooding the court with politically insignificant cases, and in this way, he weakened the court by expanding its remit. This approach has some benefits. So for example, it may stave off international pressures to further democratize. On the other hand, the public can still use these laws and resultant civic space, however limited, to organize opposition. And this can allow challenges to the ruler, for instance, as seen in the recent protests in Hong Kong. There are many terms for these dynamics, such as legal authoritarianism, competitive authoritarianism, hybrid regimes, non-democracies, and so on. And I use this umbrella term, the paradox of restraint, to focus on the specific tension between the rule of law and arbitrary power. So how then do authoritarian rulers control society in contexts where ordinary people may be able to access democratic institutions and the state has limited reach? Most political science scholarship focuses on how rulers must constantly balance these tensions, strategically deploying coercion and patronage. I seek to build on this scholarship by studying how sporadic encounters with the authoritarian state can have long-term and sustained political effects over people's daily lived experiences through the mechanism of gender. My study draws on feminist international relations, which has a rich scholarship on militarism and militarized masculinities, due to the foundational role of the military in the identity and functioning of the nation state. In this tradition, my study seeks to trace militarization from geopolitics to the everyday, to unmask power as it emerges and circulates at the level of micropolitics. So I start then with a reconceptualization of militarized masculinities that helps understand how and why it works as a mechanism to project authoritarian power. I conceptualize gender as performed and enacted. Gender identities can be multiple and complex, and at times overlapping and contradictory. Scholarship on militarized masculinities often describes it as hypermasculine, a space that favors dominance, assertiveness, aggressiveness, independence, self-sufficiency, and a willingness to take risks, a process that produces manly warriors. But militarized masculinity also values characteristics typically associated with femininity, like sacrifice, compassion, and cooperation. So these contradictions between unaccountable and unrestrained aggression on the one hand and order and discipline on the other are in many ways well recognized. Broadly speaking, existing scholarship responds to this contradiction by seeking to reconcile it. For instance, by identifying and describing new hybrid types of masculinities, which demonstrate the machinery or how the machinery of rule adapts to absorb more inclusive values, while at the same time remaining hegemonic. Examples include the tough and tender soldier, softer militarized masculinities, or muscular humanitarianism. And these concepts share the idea of trying to relate contradictory characteristics, but they do so by creating an amalgam that is somewhere in between the two extremes. My proposal is different. Rather than reconcile the contradictions of militarized masculinities, I propose that keeping them in tension has important political effects. In this sense, I see militarized masculinities as relying on disciplined order overlaid upon the will to kill. It is characterized by unpredictable moments of exceptional violence and the potential for such moments. So in this way, when authoritarian rulers in low-capacity states perform militarized masculinity, they enact the paradox of restraint. By combining elements of discipline with elements of unaccountable violence in gendered performances, these rulers replicate the very same tension in which the rule of law is overlaid upon arbitrary executive power. I argue that this foregrounds the potential for state violence and helps translate distant and sporadic acts of state authority into everyday lives of ordinary people. So now let me give you a couple of examples of authoritarian rulers who perform culturally specific versions of militarized masculinity and how these performances rely on contradiction held in tension. So first, consider Vladimir Putin of Russia. Putin has been described as macho, physically potent, and fearless. One scholar describes Putin's persona as modeled on the Machiavellian prince and Hollywood action heroes, a masterful, self-confident alpha male, apparently in full control of both himself and the nation, who projects an aura of self-restraint. Putin's regime has been described as a world innovator in non-democratic practice. The regime employs both legal and illegal means of managing political opposition. For instance, it has filtered candidates and supported parties that express multiple viewpoints but remain loyal to the regime. It has also resorted to ballot box fraud. The regime has been backed by the Nazi youth group, likened by some to the Hitler Youth, pointing to the militarized symbolic world of Putin's regime. The existence of critical media outlets, though marginal, has helped cultivate a veneer of free speech. However, the Kremlin intervenes strategically to shape media narratives, for example, orchestrating changes in ownership, pressurizing investors, or using legal means to censor unfavorable news coverage. In the Philippines, President Rodrigo Duterte has been described as displaying a militant form of masculinity and employing machismo populism based on the degradation of women. He's been photographed kissing young women and is generally known for making demeaning comments about women and sexualizing and objectifying them. Duterte's regime is characterized by arbitrary exercise of violence under the cloak of legality. Duterte has justified extrajudicial killings for alleged drug dealers and detention of dissenters without trial as prioritizing law and order over procedural justice for criminals. He has received support from the Duterte youth, whose leader advocated military training for all Filipino youth. Under Duterte's leadership, the legal system has been weaponized against his opponents. Key opposition politicians have been arrested and detained on spurious charges, and lawsuits have been filed against the former president and former budget secretary. At the same time, human rights lawyers have initiated legal cases for police accountability, demonstrating continued hope that the law will be upheld. Though Duterte's flamboyant machismo contrasts with Putin's stoicism, both rulers perform culturally and historically resonant versions of militarized masculinity. Each ruler also contends differently with the challenges posed by democratic institutions. While Duterte calls explicitly for extra-legal violence in the name of law and order, Putin is paradigmatically restrained, using more subtle strategies to hollow out democratic institutions. The two cases show how the contradictions fundamental to militarized masculinities enact and reinforce the paradox of restraint. So now let me show how this national level performance of militarized masculinity can project power to the grassroots, drawing on the case of Uganda, where I conducted qualitative fieldwork between 2014 and 2018. My fieldwork was primarily focused on informal security actors like vigilantes and militias, and was conducted primarily in the north of the country. Uganda, under its current ruling regime, in many ways clearly illustrates the paradox of restraint. Uganda's president, Yoweri Museveni, came to power in 1986 through a rebel movement. His National Resistance Army became the basis for the government today. When he came to power, he initially implemented a no-party system, where the regime and state were fused and all Ugandans were de facto considered part of the ruling regime. The country became multi-party in 2005 by a referendum vote. And some analyses have argued that this move to multi-partyism was curated by the regime as a way to strengthen the party and further centralize power, while appealing to Western calls to democratize. Indeed, in legalizing opposition parties, the NRM gained the ability to exclude its critics and distance them from political power. Museveni has been regularly re-elected, and all but the most recent elections were approved by international observers. Like Duterte and Putin, Museveni has cultivated his own particular form of militarized masculinity. For the first several decades of his rule, he often wore military fatigues and frequently stays in the barracks when he travels within Uganda. He has been described ambiguously as bridging opposites, a synthesis of soldier and intellectual, adopting a secularized Puritanism. Museveni links militarism and strength to a notion of paternalism, restraint, and discipline. He is sometimes called the father of the country and likens Uganda to a banana plantation that he has cultivated and which is now bearing fruit. In Uganda, militarization is both material and symbolic and pervades the political and economic spheres. Jude Kagoro has described this as a warriorized field of power in which citizens are accustomed to a melding of the military and politics and attach a high socio-political value to the military and its associated ethos, such as uniform, gun, rank, training, and participation in war. The regime hosts numerous free military trainings for civilians that include both physical training and propaganda on government effectiveness. And these trainings are often advertised as helpful to find employment. This militarization of the public sphere means that performances of gender that correspond to militarized masculinities are frequently associated with preferential access to resources and power. And this is particularly significant in a context where the political economy is so extensively militarized. On the other hand, in some contexts, soldiers have fewer rights than civilians in the sense that they're very much under the thumb of the authoritarian state. They face court-martialing to be kept in line and significant pressure not to engage in politics, but rather to support the politicized state. The values reflected in civilian notions of masculinity in northern Uganda differ importantly from the central features of militarized masculinity that I've highlighted. In contrast to a loyalty to the state, the values orienting civilian masculinity in northern Uganda focus on protecting and providing for wives and children and being a good arbiter, being even-keeled, fair, and helping resolve people's problems peacefully. To raise a proper family, it is necessary to have land for the family compound. Traditionally, land would also be central to livelihoods for raising livestock and farming. Access to land, which is determined patrilineally, also offers intergenerational links, including connection to ancestry. Chris Dolan, who has written extensively about masculinity in northern Uganda, notes that there is no specific idea about how violence should be used. Rather, he writes that there is a loud silence on violence. I also found this in my own research. The association between militarized masculinity and the state is further reinforced by a long history of political violence. Northern Uganda was the epicenter of a 20-year-long conflict between rebels and the government, which came to an informal end in 2006. And during the conflict, nearly the entire civilian population was forcibly displaced to camps, which drastically undermined civilian abilities to fulfill ideals of masculinity or femininity. And Philipp Schulz, who is with us today, has written an amazing book about gendered violence during the conflict and its long-term effects on notions of masculinity. And here I just highlight a few key points. Displacement from land meant that civilians were unable to engage in basic social functions like marriage or proper birthing rituals. Displacement also undermined men's ability to provide for their family members. NGOs gave food aid directly to women, further undermining men's roles as providers. And during this period, soldiers regularly asserted their dominance over civilians, for instance, marrying civilian women or demanding men carry out traditionally female tasks. So in these ways, the conflict really exacerbated these tensions between militarized masculinity and civilian gendered norms, with important implications for state authority, as I'll illustrate. So I now want to turn to a micro-level case to try to further unpack how militarized masculinity can be a key mechanism that projects authoritarian power. The case is of a community security meeting that I attended in 2015. And these meetings often occur ad hoc to address any security concerns in the community, for instance, if there's a spate of petty theft. The case shows how the performance and rhetoric of militarized masculinities foreground the tension that I described between arbitrary violence and disciplined order. When performances of militarized masculinity interface with the gendered norms held by ordinary citizens, it projects state power and authority into the public and private spheres of everyday life. This particular meeting took place in a neighborhood next to the military barracks. The meeting was called to address a fight between a soldier and a civilian over a woman. Each man claimed that the woman was his wife, in this case meaning that he had a proprietary sexual relationship with her. In this area, soldiers and civilians live in close proximity. There's a small vegetable market and several drinking and music joints that cater to the soldiers, whose monthly salaries contribute a really significant influx of cash into this poor peri-urban community. Although the barracks are fenced, civilians continue to farm on small plots of land inside, which have been communally owned before the barracks were built there. The day before the meeting, the day of the meeting, approximately 30 women sat on mats, and 15 or so civilian men sat around the perimeter on benches. 7 soldiers, some in uniform and others in civilian dress, sat on chairs facing the civilians. The general tone of the meeting was hostile, though throughout, soldiers and civilians repeatedly emphasized the need to live in peace and harmony. Much of the conversation focused on chastising unnamed women, presumed guilty of adultery and prostitution, and assailing these faceless perpetrators with accusations of bringing death and shame to the community. Bringing death referred both to women being a catalyst for violent fights and also as a potential conduit for spreading HIV. Another strand of the conversation focused on who should be able to regulate the economic activities of community members. Some of the soldiers spoke in Swahili, the language of the Ugandan military, which is generally not spoken in the north, while others spoke in local dialect. So I'll now highlight just a couple of quotes drawn from my notes that reflect some key points of the meeting. So this soldier spoke early in the meeting, and he emphasizes that soldiers are not peacekeepers. They're agents of violence with access to guns and energy for fighting. And he says that a civilian's stick is no match for the soldier's gun. In this way, he suggests that soldiers are acting unnaturally when asked to keep the peace. At the same time, he notes that the higher authorities are concerned if a soldier abuses civilians and uses this to encourage the civilians to take their complaints to the military bureaucracy rather than fighting. And this foregrounds the potential order and discipline of the military structure as well. He proposes that if the civilians do not turn over the woman responsible for the conflict, the soldiers might restrict civilian access to their gardens inside the barracks. And this is potentially a significant threat for families that may rely on subsistence farming. It is also a denial of the civilians' claims to the land that the barracks are built on. The soldier concludes by urging the community members to act before a soldier or a civilian dies, juxtaposing this comment to the reminder that the soldiers have superior access to force. This strongly hints at an undercurrent of potentially lethal and unaccountable violence associated with the military. In this way, the soldier places responsibility for the conflict with the civilians, proposing that if a soldier reverts to hypermasculine expression of violence, the state's institutions may grind into action, but this would be too late to contain the damage. At one point, an elderly man intervened, and he refers to the darkness of the war and how it destroyed families and a Chole culture. The unspoken implication was that the soldiers provided the security that was essential for peace, and without them, war could in some ways, could potentially break out again. He also points to the tension over land claims, both thanking Museveni for giving civilians access to the land and noting that the source of water our grandfathers have been drinking is in the barracks, highlighting the civilians' paternally derived claim to that land. The man also acknowledges that catering to the desires of the soldiers, such as drinking and hiring sex, is one of the few options for civilian employment, and argues that it may therefore be a necessary bad in pursuit of certain gendered values, like educating children. So I'll conclude with this quote from a male youth who notes that soldiers no longer use unrestrained violence like they did during the war. Now they are more organized. But he also highlights how militarized masculinities, when they interact with civilian life, can cause chaos. He likens this to the social chaos created during the conflict, in which he says incest contributed to the spread of HIV. The reference to HIV has strong historical resonances with the conflict, when it was believed that relationships among soldiers and civilians helped spread HIV amongst the civilian population. He further describes an environment where the social order is overturned, for example, with a mother loving a young man, and he concludes that the soldier should be careful when engaging in sexual relationships with women, implying that their salubriousness could contribute to their own undoing. The youth also emphasizes the soldiers' ability to lure civilian women with their superior access to resources, keeping them outside the reach of the community, without committing to marrying them or to raising their children. He argues that civilian men are economically precarious compared to soldiers, who, because of their affiliation to the Ugandan state, have salaries and homes independent from communal norms. So after discussing for several hours, the soldiers left the meeting, officially planning to reconvene the following week. This meeting never took place, however. After the soldiers left, the community identified a woman in their midst who they blamed for the conflict. She was expelled from the market and threatened with expulsion from the community. She was also accused of being HIV positive. I interpreted this conclusion to the meeting as a way of transforming the threat of violence among men into a pathological threat contained in a female body that could then be expelled from the community, allowing the problem to be managed locally and without reforming the behavior of civilian men or soldiers. So what I find really helpful about this case is that it shows how the confrontation between different masculine ideal types can create tensions that shape citizen behavior, not just in the public sphere, but also in private spaces. And this helps us understand how and why ordinary people might orient their lives around an authoritarian state that in many ways appears distant or only sporadically powerful. So from the case, I identify three pathways in which these encounters shape the private sphere. And in the paper, I call them vectors to show directionality and to reflect this idea of transmission from the state into the everyday. The first is via livelihoods. As highlighted by several statements, civilian livelihoods become intertwined with the soldiers and their salaries, placing pressure on civilian ideals of a good life. In the meeting, we can identify several ways that civilians attempt to mitigate these pressures, for example, by separating economic activities from the local social order. For instance, the elderly man argues that if good intentions motivate bar operators, then this transgression can be seen as an exception. In a quote that didn't make it into this presentation, the village chairman described the soldier's payday as a discrete moment in time when sex work occurs, thereby placing temporal limits on the indiscretion and seeking to isolate it from everyday life. Second, the structure of the economy paired with the nature of the soldier's movements injects tension described above into the home. Movement is key to a proper Acholi gendered relations. Traditionally, a wife should come from far and be brought to the husband's house. The very word for woman in Acholi derives from the word for migration. Soldiers upend these ideals. They're regularly transferred to different areas of the country, disembedded from family and land. Rather than finding a wife and bringing her to the family compound, they find and take women wherever they are stationed. They have women live with them, but they don't get properly married. And this was highlighted, for instance, in the youth's quote when he notes that soldiers can keep women in the barracks outside the reach of the community. Finally, bloodlines, which for civilians in northern Uganda are key to reproduction, belonging, and social order, determining both access to land and appropriate conjugal relations. In the meeting, the centrality of bloodlines is highlighted, for instance, by the young man who discusses the threat of HIV, which was seen as a major health crisis in Uganda in the 1980s and early 1990s. Linking this conflict to bloodlines and HIV made the root of the conflict embodied in a woman, as I mentioned previously. However, it has another effect as well. HIV is a harm that could imperil military men via their so-called masculine desires. However, this threat is again housed in the female body, further reinscribing the fragility of civilian men's grasp on their role as providers and protectors. The civilian men cannot pick a stick to bring to a soldier. Instead, they're placed on the sidelines and must watch and wait for soldiers' actions to lead to their own undoing. So by linking feminist scholarship to recent research on modern authoritarianism, I've argued that performances of militarized masculinities can enact a paradox of restraint and foreground the ambiguities of authoritarian power in the daily lives of ordinary citizens. This mechanism is particularly effective in regimes where the military is directly associated with the authority of the ruler. The adoption and performance of militarized masculinities by state actors, in this case, government soldiers, embody two equally compelling versions of state authority. First, as a powerful but disciplined order maker, and second, as a capricious and unpredictable agent of violence. When civilians encounter these performances, they're both confronted with the tension of militarized masculinities on their own terms and engaged in producing militarized masculinities as set apart from local ideals about proper gendered identities and order. So I've thus proposed that gender, and particularly militarized masculinities, is an underexplored mechanism for translating national level authoritarian power to the grassroots, simultaneously emphasizing the regime's capacity for capricious and unaccountable violence and the continued relevance of the rule of law. This analysis helps to explain how today's authoritarian rulers project and sustain power, even as they struggle to balance elite demands and societal discontent with an institutional setting that allows both to air grievances. And so thank you so much for your time and attention, and I will cede the floor.
I hope my connection has been a little bit unstable so that I got kicked out twice or so. So I hope that doesn't happen again. But thank you so much for organizing this, for everyone involved, and for the invitation to be part of this and to have a chance to engage with Rebecca's amazing work. And thank you, Rebecca, for that paper, but also for that really great presentation. Rebecca and I actually met in Gulu in northern Uganda in, I think, 2016, right? When we were both doing field work. The incidents you describe in the article you say was from 2015, but I don't know if you did some follow-up research sort of during that time. And so I think it's really great to now actually have a chance to engage with some of that work that emerged from that encounter when we first met. And also, in the interest of full disclosure, maybe I also want to acknowledge that I actually did have a chance and had the pleasure of reading a previous version of this before it was published. Which is just to say that on the one hand, it's really great to see how this has developed and to see this out published and talked about now, but also to say that many of my initial maybe comments or questions and reactions were already addressed in that final version. So to the extent that maybe, I kind of feel a little bit that any constructive criticism or comments I feel I once might have had were already accommodated for. But here we go in terms of what still comes to my mind. So I want to begin with sort of, the praise part, of course. And I think the article does a really incredible job at really bridging a macro level analysis of how social control in authoritarian contexts works, and bridging that with a really rich and detailed and empirically heavy micro level analysis and observations, of how that plays out in this particular context, which I think works really well. And I'm not at all familiar with the political science literature on authoritarianism, but I do have a feeling that, much of that research operates mostly at a macro level and makes broad sort of sweeping claims about how that sort of operates. And so I think having this really rich analysis of these mechanisms on the micro level of how the national level power operates and then travels and trickles down from the micro level to the macro level offers some really unique insights and contributes towards moving that field forward. I also think, Rebecca, that your engagement with feminist IR literature on the manifestations and the dynamics of militarized masculinity here does a really fantastic job at highlighting not only how this form of power is inherently militarized and masculinized, but also how gender in general and militarized masculinities in particular here serve as a catalyst or as a conduit or a vector, as you say, to enact that political power. And in particular, the ways in which I think you work around in the article with these ideas of ruptures, both in the context of masculinities and within the paradox of restraints, and how they reinforce each other and thereby offer that sort of fertile ground, I think, for militarized masculinities to do the job that you explain works really, really well. I also think then that the ways in which you illustrate these gender tensions and how they produce gender power by looking at very diverse contexts from the Philippines to Russia and Uganda show very clearly how that, how these different elements link and how it's not just sort of restricted to this one particular context. And I think there would be a whole variety of different examples to draw on, whether that be India or Tanzania's Magufuli, or maybe even the US, where we can see similar tendencies, I think. Now then, as someone whose work focuses geographically on northern Uganda and thematically on how gender operates in post-conflict spaces, I really enjoyed that analytical section that unpacked this incidence in the box market that you described and how these interactions plays out. And I think you do a really amazing job at conveying your observations, and reading that section in particular, I really felt sort of, and seeing the pictures paired to that in your presentation, I really felt brought back to Gulu, which was a nice feeling in these times where we cannot really travel. So thanks for that, and a note to comment on your beautiful writing style there. I do have sort of two smaller comments or questions which would pertain the article, and then two maybe broader questions which sort of go beyond that and might not have anything to do with it, but that sort of just came to my mind when I was reading it. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that. And I'll start with the two smaller questions specifically containing the article. And again, I think your analysis shows really clearly how the soldiers' interactions with civilians in northern Uganda transfer and enact that form of militarized masculinity vis-a-vis the civilians, more subordinated forms of masculinity, and how that then reinforces power dynamics. But I was wondering perhaps about how that enactment of militarized masculinities by political leaders, so in this context, for instance, Museveni, how that would sort of transfer to the soldiers in the first place, who then reenact that and then carry that into the communities, right? So if I understand your analysis or argument correctly, the soldiers are kind of the middlemen here between the political leadership at the top and then the civilians, at the bottom of that. And I was wondering if that's, first sort of step of that chain, if that's done through military ideology or military training or something else. And, in many ways, I think that might seem pretty obvious of how that happens and how that's done, but I wonder if this really is such a linear process as it might first appear, or if there's any tensions or ruptures in that process as well. And then secondly, and this comment arose from a conversation I have just listened to also in Edinburgh at the Politics and IR department, which was a symposium on the scholarship by Cynthia Enlow, and which included many great points and discussions about militarized masculinities. And it made me wonder, in relation to the work that you do here, how this interplay between masculinities and authoritarian power is specifically dependent on militarized masculinities and not just on, hegemonic forms of masculinity. So in other words, what are the specifics of, or the specific aspects of militarism here? Because, many of these tenets of militarized masculinity, such as dominance, assertiveness, aggressiveness, independence that you list, they're also all crucial aspects of masculinities, at least if they're defined in hegemonic terms. And so, I wonder if this enactment of political power and masculinity could also be done by other agents of the state, which might not necessarily be soldiers in there. And again, I think the answer to that is probably included in your article, but if you have anything, specifically to say about that and unpack that, I'd be curious to hear that. Am I going beyond the time that I'm allocated to speak, or how am I doing with that?
Yeah, you can take a couple of minutes more, but...
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll do maybe one more point and then I'll see how I'm doing after that.
Thank you.
And so, this is a point which goes beyond the scope of the article, but it arises sort of from engaging with it. And you begin the article with that observation that recent years have witnessed the rise of strongman politics and rulers around the world, including in states that also maintain democratic institutions. And in addition to the examples you engage with in your article, as I said before, there are indeed a whole variety of other examples that come to my mind, at least, including in what we would call consolidated democracies in the West, including, for instance, Boris Johnson in the UK or the former President Trump in the US. And your article then shows how performances of political power are mirrored by citizens on the local level. And I wonder if there's something to say about how these dynamics play out in the context of the current COVID-19 crisis, particularly so maybe in the UK and in the US, where both Johnson and Trump have enacted a very masculinized and also militarized response to the virus and have constantly downplayed its actual threat, not to admit any insecurities or vulnerabilities of the nation, have refused and continue to refuse to wear masks, and etc. And then, on the local level, we also see heavily gender dynamics of how citizens enact that. And research shows that men more often refuse to wear masks or to abide social distancing rules. And at least here in Germany, many of the participants of any of the anti-vaccine demonstrations are men. Men are behind the conspiracy theories. And so I wonder if we can perhaps also in this context see how that enactment of a certain type of masculinity by political leaders then sort of trickles down to its citizens on the local level, and how this operates to exercise political power, and how this is inherently gendered. And yeah, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that and how that sort of, how that transfer of power there plays out in that particular context. Perhaps I'm going to leave it at that now, I think, and let Christine have a chance to jump in and then open it up for questions. But yeah, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that. But I did really, appreciate and enjoy engaging with your work. So thanks a lot for that, Rebecca.
Thanks very much indeed, Philipp. Once again, very full comments. So Christine.
Okay, thank you very much. Hopefully I'm going to be coherent, but I feel like I'm reaching an end of term exhaustion. So I think what was really interesting to me, first of all, there's a bit of resonance with some of the points Philipp makes, but both in the paper itself and the presentation, I kind of felt there was like 3 different papers there. And I mean, I know you're exploring it and I know it is reflective of a much broader bit of work, but I thought it was worth just referencing because I think each one of them raises questions. And then a bit like Philipp, I wondered about what was the interconnection were the interconnections a little bit elided between these sections? So I think there's a really interesting theory, first of all, about militarization of populism. And I know we all have debates about populism, but I'm seeing it as a completely pejorative term that describes a form of promising more than you can deliver politically, because logically everything can't be delivered politically, and coupling that with increased forms of authoritarianism in the form of delivery. And it seemed to me you had an interesting thesis here, which is, which is in the title, which I found persuasive, which is that there's something sort of distinctive about doing this within the frame of democratic institutions. This was the paradox of restraint, in some senses, although not entirely, of the title. And I suppose I had then questions of this. So, always you raise it in a really comparative way with Duterte and Putin, which was reflected in the presentation. And then in some senses, it goes into this very local context. But I wondered was, where are you going with that theory, right? So kind of, so I mean, these are genuine questions and not some clever critique, I have to say, because I think they're really interesting. And as a constitutional lawyer, particularly in the centre, actually, and with, Asanga's work on Sri Lanka, we're looking all the time at sort of what might be democratic backsliding, or, the new coup making where you don't do a coup, like even in Myanmar, you say, actually, the election wasn't free and fair, or you just subtly use a constitutional amendment to extend your term limits. So constitutional means of rejecting constitutionalism and democracy are very much in vogue, way beyond even the context of which you talk about. And then I think there is a sort of more recent development, which US and UK are a part of, really established democracies showing some of these tendencies as well, with the jury being a little bit out on whether the mechanisms of restraint will actually curb them and be effective or not. And in some senses, America kind of acquitted itself. But I wondered about whether in that equation, is this just a purely strategic instrumentalist thing? Or is there something about coupling democracy with strong man tactics that gets us to some different place? And I'm not sure, and I wasn't sure. So for example, in the context of what we might call low-level democracy, which would probably be a state above what you call low capacity states, so Sri Lanka, Northern Ireland. My colleagues Fanula and Colin Campbell argued that this non-paradigmatic transition, there's something about the veneer of democracy and the state's self-belief in its own democratic credentials that makes it blind to, for example, human rights violations of emergency legislation. So they're actually arguing that there's a relationship between how the state will, for example, bring itself to account and be prepared to bring itself to account. But it struck me that in low capacity states, it's maybe that's not really there, and it just felt to be more strategic instrumentalist. Let's just do what we want, but let's be smart enough to keep the international community off our back by doing it through things that are a bit harder to call out as anti-democratic. So I wondered, did you see something integral about the relationship? And then I suppose the second paper, to call it that, is really around the idea that this translates into militarism on the ground. And here I think my question is really similar to Philipp's, of going, well, so the masculized militarism in the Ugandan case in particular just looked like really straightforward militarism that's always hyper-masculinized in points where the military is actually active as a military. I can't really see any example of non-hyper-masculinized militaries. Maybe that's an interesting question in itself. And it just looked like a really crude sort of masculinized militarism and not very subtle. And I wondered, I got it more from the presentation on the paper to sort of say, well, this paradox of restraint then plays out in the paradox of metaphors of compassion, or well, first of all, there didn't seem a lot of compassion then in the stories that you told. I didn't see the softer side of that, although I think we did see it in the militarized opposition story you told of the Achole. So it just felt to me like a sort of hyper-nationalized, hyper-masculinized. I had an additional question here, which is that there's an intersectionality that enters really strongly into the factual descriptions you give, but isn't so much theorized, and it'd be interesting to hear more of that. So obviously, you know, it's there even in the anecdote you talk about the Swahili versus the local languages, and the colonial is very strong in the colonial history, but in some senses you don't really play with it. And it struck me that, you know, work like Nira Ural Davis, looking at how nationalisms are always also masculinized, and notions of the nation, and also the counterposed nation of the subaltern identity is also similarly, and in some senses this also helps, I think, explain the story of expulsion of the women and why women end up on the wrong ends of both those forms of nationalism and then paying the price for them. So I just wondered why in the future of the work you're sort of bringing a form of intersectionality around ethnic or tribal identity and gender identities, because it's always there, but it's always very difficult to provide an account of, I think. And then I think the last paper, or the last sort of argument to some senses is, yes, these vectors, and I thought they were really interesting. And, you know, in some senses, the whole paper really took me back to where I was part of, in fact, I shouldn't really say this in a seminar, but I partly met my husband through this work, but he was doing a project on police harassment in Northern Ireland, and I actually came in to do all the interviews around gender and with the LGBT community, partly sort of, you know, because we felt we needed, it wasn't really appropriate for a man to do them. And what was really interesting there was that gender wasn't a form of targeting, and neither was LGBT identity, but it was a form of targeting and a perceived vulnerability and targeting Republican community. And lots of the examples are really similar to your marketplace discussion in a very curious way in working class areas of Derry and West Belfast. But I wondered, did you see these factors as totally specific to Uganda? So livelihoods, bloodlines and home, because it struck me in that work at the time, and it struck me with regard to feminist work, that we have this huge debate about public and private, and Western feminists critique liberalism and liberal feminists in the West for not acknowledging the gender dimension of the public-private divide. But it really strikes me from my own experience in Northern Ireland, and particularly from that work and the experience of being quite connected to those communities, and from your work, that, you know, when you're a woman experiencing these cultures, actually getting the military out of your home and reconstructing some private space at all is really quite important, right? And in that, and this kind of links me back in a circle to your initial point, because, you know, what the democratic state offers, for better or for worse, is a separate public and private space. And although we can come along with sort of fancy feminist criticisms of it, and I'm not saying your work does this, you know, and I mean, I understand these as well. The public-private space enables domestic violence in the family, etc. But when you're encountering militarized masculinities that can assert the power of the state and use them to walk into your house, and to essentially walk all over you, then actually you need the public-private divide to get it back out. So I just sort of wondered, given that this public-private theme is so critical to the stories you tell, you know, where do you see, you know, so is the remedy, maybe we could put it that way, is the remedy to re-institutionalize better the strengths of the democratic state, or is there a sort of another way forward at all? And I'll maybe just stop there. But I mean, I think the work's fascinating. I suppose the last thing, if you have time in the questions, I'm sure this will come up, but I suppose just was really interesting to reflect on and I mean, this was sort of something I was thinking that took me back to my own sort of similar, very micro level research, but you know, thinking about your own place as a researcher, navigating the language barriers, the cultural barriers, and even whether you felt that sitting in on the meeting changed the dynamics of it. So I think the research methods piece of how you did what you did, and I'm sure Philipp can talk about this too, and the gender dynamics of that itself, I suspect is probably a piece in its own right that I hope is in the book and or comes out of this.
Thanks very much indeed, Christine.